second week of Noah further gives us a typology of Jesus Christ in that, in the days of Noah, fallen angels ruled the earth. Now that is clearly read in the Bible in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. God assigned Noah to preach to that generation, warning them of God's coming judgment upon the earth on account of their sin. And this is why Apostle Peter called Noah a preacher of righteousness. Let's read that now in 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Noah preached that God would bring a flood to bring an end to the activity of fallen angels and man's sin by them, and that God would then renew the earth after the flood. Jesus also came at a time of darkness and preached the dissolution of the traditions of man that had taken hold of faith and ruled the hearts of men. He preached the dissolution of Moses and a new law of grace in himself. He preached a renewal in himself. He overturned the tables of the money changers, Matthew 21:13. He preached against the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, Luke 11:44. He preached a transition from Moses to himself, John 6:32 through 47. We are now in the second eighth week. God has assigned the second eighth week as an extension of Jesus' ministry in this time to preach to this generation the dissolution of the tradition of man that held the church captive during the sixth week. The second eighth week is also a time of preaching the restitution of all things. Jesus is bringing renewal. The preaching of the second eighth week was prophesied by Enoch, as we read earlier. Then after that there shall occur the second eighth week, the week of righteousness. A sword shall be given to it, in order that judgment shall be executed in righteousness on the oppressor, and sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. Now let's talk about why the eighth week follows the fifth week. The eighth week is seen to follow the fifth week because King David also symbolizes Jesus Christ. As David was a king and shepherd, so Jesus is the King of kings and the shepherd of his sheep. Revelation 19:16. And he has on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of kings and Lord of lords. And also John 10:11. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. The eighth week follows the fifth week because Jesus has the key of David. What is the key of David? Well, let's read from Revelation 3:7. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says he that is holy, he that is true, he that has the key of David, he that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. Jesus has the key of David. So what is the key of David? David was used of God to transition the tabernacle from skins to stone, and Jesus transitioned the tabernacle from stones to skin, meaning himself. Let's read now from 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 11 and 12. Then David gave to Solomon his son the pattern of the porch, and of the houses thereof, and of the place of the mercy seat, and the pattern of all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord, and all the chambers round about, of the treasuries of the house of God, and of the treasuries of the dedicated things. We see that God initiated a change from the tabernacle of skins through Moses to the tabernacle of stones through David. Then in 1 Corinthians 3:16, we read that God initiated another change. Know you not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? Your body is now the temple of the Holy Ghost. God has taken faith from the table of the altar to the table of the soul. God set a new pattern for faith in Jesus Christ. As we can see, the steward is the key to the new week. So why is this important for us to know? Well, God brings to our attention that He always selects a steward to take His people from dissolution to renewal. In each week of God's plan, He selected an individual and raised him up to fulfill His word. God always sends somebody. When it was time for the flood, who did God send to preserve life? He sent Noah. When it was time to fetch His people out of Egypt, who did God send to bring His people through the transition? It was Moses. When it was time to choose a people to Himself, who did God communicate with? It was Abraham. The key is the steward. The key is in God's hand to turn the lock to open the door for you. Now who is the steward and key of the second eighth week whom God has appointed to take the church from dissolution to renewal? And now let's turn our attention to the sixth week. As we see in this illustration, the sixth week divides the first eighth week from the second eighth week. The first eighth week was the time of Jesus' ministry and that of the apostles. The church grew in grace and in knowledge, being in one accord, one faith, believing in one Lord. The sixth week is the period of darkness which soon followed. As Apostle Paul wrote, "After my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock." Acts 20:29. How many times have you heard people say, "What's wrong with the church?" And how many times have you asked that question yourself? The church has nearly 2,000 years of the tradition of man to overcome. During the sixth week, true apostolic governance disappeared. Error prevailed. The apostasy of faith was evident. There was no growth, no true faith in open stewardship ruled. What we are seeing now through the second eighth week is a re-emergence of true apostolic governance. Truth is restored to the church. God has assigned a new steward and key for this week who is giving new knowledge and a new priesthood. Now let's look at how God prophesied of this time of bondage for the church. The time of bondage for the church was symbolized by Samson, whose 2 eyes were put out upon the betrayal of Delilah. This act represented the 2,000 years of spiritual blindness that would come upon the church after the first eighth week. As you may recall, Samson was left to grind in the mill of his captors. This showed the judge and contact point subject to the Philistines, and how his labor for them was in vain. This was prophetic of the mockery the church would endure when the government was no longer on Jesus' shoulders. In this illustration, we are shown what darkness means. The church has been imprisoned by the serpent, or Satan, who has put out the eyes of the church. God assigned the serpent to eat dust, and Satan's children do the same. They dine on the dust of the world, which is the fruitless knowledge of Satan's kingdom. And this is why darkness prevails in the church. In this illustration, we also see that the church lost the beauty of her hair, which is symbolic of losing the headship of Jesus Christ and the true knowledge of faith. She is walking by a false light, which is symbolic of the many illusions and false doctrines that are used to guide the church in the absence of apostolic governance. We see further types and shadows of the nearly 2,000 years of bondage for the church through Moses. You may recall that the children of Israel in the wilderness were in need of water, and God commanded Moses to speak to the rock, and he would provide water out of the rock. But Moses smote the rock twice. Let's read that now in Numbers chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. God spoke unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, and gather the assembly together, you and Aaron your brother, and speak unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water, and you shall bring forth to them water out of the rock. So you shall give the congregation and their beasts drink. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock. And he said unto them, Hear now, you rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. The rock symbolized Christ, and we read that in 1 Corinthians 10:4. And this smiting of the rock, in contradiction to the word of the Lord, symbolized the 2,000 years the church would be smitten. When God rebuked Moses, he was also speaking to the church, saying, Because you believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. Numbers 20:12. Now let's talk about the former and latter rain. Hosea 6:2 and 3 reads, After 2 days, or after 2,000 years after Christ, he will revive us. In the 3rd day, now that's in the 3rd millennium after the resurrection of Christ, he will raise us up, and we will live in his sight. Then shall we know if we follow on to know the Lord. His going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come unto us as the rain, the latter and former rain upon the earth. The former rain is the first 8th week, and the latter rain is the second 8th week.